Chapter 20, Tuesday, July 2nd to Tuesday, July 9th, 1776. The Congress have judged it necessary to dissolve the connection between Great Britain and the American colonies, and to declare them free and independent states, as you will perceive by the enclosed declaration. I am directed to request you have it proclaimed at the head of the army in the way you shall think most proper. Letter from John Hancock, President of the Continental Congress, to General George Washington. That week unspooled slowly with hot days and muggy, breathless nights. Militia units from the surrounding colonies piled into the city. Ordinary folks skedaddled out of it fast as their horses or feet would carry them. The extra soldiers were not the cleanest sort, or maybe they were too busy drilling and making gunpowder cartridges to wash. Whatever the cause, New York soon smelled like a garbage pit mixed with a fresh mountain of manure. The stench cooked under the midsummer sun. Madame's mood changed with the tide. One moment she floated on clouds of fancy, imagining her grand life once the British beat the rebels. Next, she fell into melancholy, grumbling about the lazy British commanders floating at anchor off Staten Island, observing New York through long spyglasses, but making no move to invade. She now carried with her a brocade pouch suspended from a red satin cord. Within the pouch lay a green flask filled with a calming elixir prescribed by the doctor. He advised her to drink from it whenever the need arose. She also took to walking around the house in her stocking feet, trying to catch me unawares as I scrubbed or dusted or polished, often with Ruth at my side. She said nothing during these encounters, but watched us with hungry hawk eyes. It unnerved me. The week after Hickey's hanging, Becky suffered a mild attack of ague that had befallen so many soldiers. She grew pale and sweaty, but did not require purging or leeches. In her stead, I went to the market. Our needs were fewer now that we no longer fed the master and his companions. 'Twas a good thing, for farmers were afeared to come into the city, and there was less to choose from. More people fled every day, including the wives of General Washington and Colonel Knox and Brigadier Greene, her that folks said was such a big flirt. I searched for Curzon every day, but Bellingham's affairs kept him out of sight. I was afraid to seek out Colonel Reagan, afraid that word would get back to Madame and our lives would be put in jeopardy. 10 days after the British flooded the river with their ships, news that Congress had declared independence arrived in New York. The declaration was read to the troops from the steps of City Hall. The men cheered so loud it seemed to shake the whole island. I hurried from the egg cellar to see the cause of the commotion. The cheering men danced and marched down Broadway, tossing their hats into the air and shouting across the river at the silent ships of England. They gathered into a mob on the Bowling Green around the massive statue of King George III. I stayed at the edge of the crowd, hoping for a glimpse of Curzon or a familiar soldier from my visit to the battery. The king was mounted on his horse, and the horse mounted on a white marble pedestal that rose to the height of 3 men standing one on top the other. Both the horse and the man were fashioned larger than could be possible, but I suppose that was the way of kings. They were both made of gold that sometimes glittered in the sunlight but dulled when the clouds interfered. Ropes appeared as if conjured, thick ropes used for tying ships to the docks. The men cheered louder and worked together to throw the ropes over the king and his horse and tie them tightly. 1, 2, 3, heave! 1, 2, 3, heave! The men strained their arms and backs. Boys on the edge of the crowd jumped up and down. Common folk stood froze at the sight of a king being pulled down by the strength of the men working together. 1, 2, 3, heave! The statue toppled, slowly at first, then gaining speed as the weight fell from the sky to the ground. The men scrambled out of the way, no one wishing to be crushed by a fallen king. As it crashed, they shouted even louder and swarmed over the thing. Axes were called for and rushed out of workshops and up from the barracks. A half a dozen men took to chopping the king and his steed to bits. I inched closer. How could they be chopping through a statue with simple axes? A piece of tail broke off, and a soldier held it up for all to see. The king was not made of gold, but of soft lead covered with gilt paint. The crowd shouted again as another soldier lifted the king's head freshly removed from his neck. A fife and drum corps started playing just beyond the mob, piping out the song usually heard during a tar and feathering party. The men made short work of King George. When the statue was reduced into pieces that could be easily carted off, they did just that. The plan was to melt down all the lead into bullets. "We'll fire Majesty at the redcoats," joked a man with a booming voice. "Aye," said his companion, shouldering an axe. "Emanations from Leaden George will make deep impressions on the enemy." As the crowd marched off to make bullets and celebrate liberty and independence in the taverns, I realized dark was fast falling, and I had tarried overly long. I picked up a sliver of lead that lay in the street. It was fringed with gilt, my own piece of majesty. Tyrants beware, I thought as I put it in my pocket. I was surprised to see the front parlor window alight when I walked down Wall Street. Is the master back? I asked Becky. She was dozing in the chair by the kitchen fire with a red check shawl around her shoulders, still worn down from her illness. Becky yawned and stretched. Far from it. Madam paid a call on the Reverend's wife after supper, came home with high color in her cheeks and a bee in her bonnet. Dress the child, she said. Make sure both of the girls eat something nourishing and sweet. Did she fall and hit her head? I asked, setting down that basket of eggs. Becky laughed. I think the Mrs. Reverend served her a dose of scripture, the hard kind. Madam says I've been too harsh on my servants. I must mend my ways, or the Lord will punish me. I was confuddled. She's being kind to Ruth again? Becky stood slowly, wincing from the aches in her bones. Surely so. Ruth lit up like a lantern when she saw them in fancy clothes again, promised to be quiet as ever, made short work of the gingerbread Madam baked too. This was too much. I sat down at the table. Madam baked? She's a fair hand in the kitchen when she puts her mind to it. Left the dishes for yours truly, but the cake was tasty. Those 2 pieces are for you. She was most firm about it. She stopped to cough up what sounded like a large wet worm from her throat. She cooked up sweet milk for you too, with nutmeg, cinnamon, and sugar. Said you was to have some with your gingerbread. I sniffed the pitcher. It smelled good enough. Did you have any? Not with this cough. Milk would stop up my lungs. I looked around the kitchen. Where's Ruth now? Becky unpinned her apron and folded it, then tied on her bonnet, preparing to go home. Madam got it in her head to play cards this eve. The 2 companions in with her, the Mrs. Drinkwater and her daughter, the one who's to marry some sort of lord or duke or some such. Ruth is in with them. She was right cheered after the cake and milk. Should I take anything in? I just come from her. Madam was most definite. Tell Sal to enjoy her cake and the night off. She has worked hard these weeks and could do with a good night's sleep. She called me Sal instead of girl? I asked. Are you full certain she didn't hit her head today? Becky laughed, and the laugh caught in her throat and the bubbled into a cough. Look here, she's likely to run back into sour old cow by breakfast. So I say, have a good sit down and enjoy a little peace. I poured a mug of milk. Huzzah for the Reverend's wife. I wanted to savor the gingerbread bite by bite and sip the milk slowly, but I couldn't help myself. The mug was drained and the plate empty soon after Becky left. The milk was the sweetest thing I had ever tasted, the spices so thick I could near chew them. No wonder Ruth was cheered by it. I washed up my dishes, tidied the kitchen, and found myself with idle hands, a rare event indeed. I could sneak into the library and borrow that Caruso book. I could read by the fire with a mending basket nearby to slip the book into should Madam approach. That seemed a fine plan, but first I wanted to shed my bodice. It pinched something awful under my arms. I felt the way down to the cellar stairs with my toes and heard the sound of laughter from Madam's company. I yawned. When would they leave? And what sort of ladies came to call this late? I removed my bodice and hung it on a nail. The pallet looked soothing and cool, and the thought of climbing the stairs again made me weary. But I would like to read a few more pages. But I was overly fatigued. But Mr. Caruso was facing all sorts of dangers. But in betwixt one thought and the other, I fell asleep. For that, I shall never forgive myself. Chapter 21. Wednesday, July 10th, 1776. To be sold at the office of William Tongue, broker. At the house of the late Mr. Waldron, near the Exchange, lower end of Broad Street, the following goods and merchandise. 1 Negro wench, 22 years old, has had smallpox, is a useful domestic, price £80. 1 Negro boy, 16 years old, price £90. 1 Negro wench, 30 years old, with or without her son, 5 years old, price $60 or £80. Advertisement in the New York Gazette and Weekly Mercury newspaper. In my dream, I stood on a sandy beach, my back to the sea, the moon over my left shoulder. An enormous map was rolled at my feet. The roads on it were marked with velvet black ink, rivers a pearly blue, mountains a speckled green. It was a map of a country I had never seen before. Just as I opened my mouth to call for Ruth, who always tagged along in my dreams, a thick mist blew over the beach. The roads on the map twined and twisted round each other, hesitating, then they rose up off the paper, no longer roads, but thick eels with amber eyes. They crawled out of the map, and I feared they would bite me. They pondered me a moment, then slithered down the beach and into the water. I awoke with a start and flung aside the blankets, looking for the eels. There were none there, nor in the potato bin. Ruth wasn't there neither, and her side of our pallet was cold. She was gone to the privy, no doubt. I needed to visit the same place. The sun was already in the trees when I stepped outside. How had I slept so late? Ruth, I called, walking towards the little building. My nose wrinkled. The Locktons would soon need to dig a new privy hole. Ruth? I knocked on the door and it swung open. The seat was empty, with a few flies buzzing in the stench. Two blue jays in the sycamore tree called loudly. There was a distant sound of officers shouting orders on Broadway and the clatter of cartwheels, but no Ruth. I made quick work of looking in the yard. The back entry to the stables was locked. She could not have gone out that way. The gate to the street was closed too, and the latch too high for Ruth to reach. Had Madame already dressed her, taken her on a call? A thought slid through me, quick and slimy as a cold eel. I ran for the kitchen door. Becky! Becky! She came out of the pantry as I flew through the door. Where's Ruth? Oh, Becky looked down at the worn tips of her shoes, then turned away from me. Her eyes were puddled up and red-rimmed. I can't find her, I said. She was gone when I woke. Have you seen her? Becky took the jar of flour down from the shelf. You know where she is, don't you? She removed the lid and stuck the scoop into the flour. Tell me! Becky shook her head from side to side. I should have started this bread earlier, she said, pouring the flour onto the bowl. The wet air will ruin the loaves. That's my concern. I should have stayed and baked in the cool of the night. She dabbed her eyes on her sleeve and measured out another scoop of flour. But Madam sent me home. Said she wanted a quiet house last night, no baking. She looked at me over her shoulders. The eels squeezed out all my air. No, I said. I wouldn't have gone if I'd known. No, no, no. I backed away, shaking my head. She didn't. She wouldn't. No. Isabelle, don't. Becky followed me down the hall, trying to control her voice. It won't change anything. What's done is done. Ruth! I screamed up the staircase. Stop, Isabelle! Becky grabbed my arm and pulled me backwards, clamping a flour-covered hand over my mouth. You can't storm around here like a banshee. Madam will beat you bloody. Me too. I pushed her hand away and wiped off the flour. Where is she? What did they do to her? She's gone, Becky said. Gone, I repeated. Gone where? Becky steadied her shoes again. Sold. I stopped hearing right. No more birds or buzzing flies or grandfather clocks marking time. Sold? I repeated, no, she's not. They didn't. Becky's eyes filled again. Yes, she said quietly. She did. I paced the hall. No, I slept too heavy last night. Didn't notice when she woke. She wandered outside. We need to find her. She could be lost, could have taken ill and fallen. Becky watched me go to and fro. The sweet milk Madam made up? I figured it contained a sleep potion, knocked you out cold so they could spirit her away. I am dreadful, powerful sorry, but they sold her away from you. It made no sense. I would have known. I would have woken up, fought them off, killed whoever tried to take her from me. I took care of Ruth. I promised Mama I always would. Becky's face shrank down to the size of a coin. It sounded like she spoke through a long wooden pipe. Madam was returning in the carriage when I arrived this morn. She said, told me not to worry about the milk spoiling no more, that Ruth was headed to Nevis, sold to a physician's family. I shook my head, trying to clear my brain pan. Where's Nevis? How do I get there? Becky's face grew larger. You need to sit down. I'll get a cloth for your head. This has been a right shock to you. Where's Nevis? My voice echoed off the walls. West Indies, Becky muttered. The islands? All of Mama's terrible stories of slave life in the islands flooded back. Ruth can't cut cane. She'll die. She'll die in a day. My feet started for the front door. Wait! Becky grabbed my arm to prevent me from running off. I questioned Madam about that very fact, questioned her right close, I did. Not to cut cane, she said, but to be a housemaid in a fine house, a physician's house, so they'll care for her should she fall. She's lying, I said. She's a spiteful, hateful liar. A door opened on the second floor. Becky, Madam asked, has someone come to call? No, ma'am, Becky said in a false, high voice. Madam came down the stairs, one hand on the railing, the other holding a sheet of paper, half covered with writing. The paintings of her dead ancestors on the wall watched her. I do not appreciate interruptions while I'm communicating with my husband, she said. What is the matter here? Nothing, ma'am, Becky stuttered. I was giving the girl her directions for the morning. Madam looked down without seeing me. She looked at my face, my kerchief, my shift neatly tucked into my skirt, looked at my shoes, pinching my feet, looked at my hands that were stronger than hers. She did not look into my eyes, did not see the lion inside. She did not see the me of me, the Isabelle. I saw her. I saw all the way down to her withered soul. I walked up 2 steps. Did you sell Ruth? You will not address me in that insolent manner. Her voice shook a little. Becky wrung her hands. Come, Isabelle, you need to peel the potatoes. Would Madam like some tea or coffee? I took another step up. Answer me, you miserable cow. Did you sell my sister? Madam backed up a step. Her letter fluttered to the bottom of the stairs. Her ancestors hung silent. Stay away from me, she said. Get back to the kitchen. She is 5 years old. I rose up another step. She is a baby, and you sold her away from me. She swallowed hard. Her hands quivered. I wanted to grab her by the hair and throw her down the stairs, throw her out a window, beat her face with my fists. I wanted her blood to splash the painting, soak the walls and wooden stairs. Isabelle, Becky warned. The sunlight coming through the window was rosy red. I took the next step. It was almost close enough to reach her. Isabelle, Becky tried again. One more step and I can have you hung, Madam whispered. I held my breath. There was a click of metal on metal. Becky had opened the front door wide. A hot wind from the street rose up the stairs, fluttering our skirts and causing me to turn. Madam grabbed a painting from the wall and threw it down on my head. I raised my arm too late and the frame crashed into me. The blow made me attopated and weakened my knees. Madam ran upstairs, screaming like a house afire. Becky dragged me down the steps and shoved me towards the open door. Run, she screamed. I ran out the front door for the first time. People walking under the shade of the sycamores across the street paused at the sight of a slave running away from a mansion where a woman was screaming. A man called after me, You, there, girl! I ran straight down wall. Didn't worry about escaping notice of soldiers or strangers, just flew over the cobblestones as fast as I could. The red fog slowly rolled out of my mind. There were more shouts behind me, and people turning to stare at the cause of the commotion. I didn't dare take time to turn around. Past City Hall, across Broadway, I leapt over the remains of a sentry fire, bumped into a gray-bearded soldier wearing a homespun shirt, and startled a man carrying 2 live hens by the feet. One of the hens broke free in an explosion of feathers. The man shook his fist and called out for someone to stop me. I ducked down one street after another, trying to find a way to the river, but the army had erected barricades at the ends of most of the roads to keep out the British. I was penned in. The shouts behind me grew louder and closer. I darted down an alley, turned blindly towards the right, and ran smack into a barrel chest of a giant. Whoa there, young filly! A deep voice boomed. Don't want to go swimming in the river, do you? I had run straight into a blacksmith. Please, sir, I said. His enormous hands released me and looked over my shoulder. Looking to get away from someone, I suspect, the blacksmith said. Behind him bellowed the coal smoke from the forge. The air was filled with the hot tang of metal and sweat. You're hurt, child, the blacksmith said. In need of some help? I wanted to spill out my story and to trust he could advise me, but he was a stranger. They were all strangers, and Ruth was gone, and there was blood on my forehead from the painting Madam threw at me, and she was going to see me hung, and I'd never be able to rescue Ruth, and she would be all alone, and... Tell them I went north, I gasped as I picked up my skirt and darted around the forge to the south. The blacksmith called after me, but his words were lost in the din of the soldiers and the sailors who cluttered my path. The wind off the river cooled my face and helped with my decision. I would turn myself over to the rebels. I had helped them fair and square. Now it was their turn. We were all fighting for liberty. Ad astra, I shouted. The words were not as magic as I had hoped, but the doors eventually opened. Colonel Reagan was sitting in a chair, a white cloth around his neck, his face covered with foamy soap and his eyes closed. Behind him stood a barber, a slave, I assumed because of his African skin, with grizzled hair and an apron. On the table beside him stood a bowl of steaming water, a leather strop for blades, and a cup of lather with a brush in it. He turned the colonel's chin with one finger, then delicately shaved away a strip of soap with a razor. By your leave, sir, said the sentry. I am busy. the colonel said without opening his eyes. This girl knew the password, insisted on seeing you, the sentry continued. The barber scraped off another stripe of soap and whiskers. Take her to Jameson, the colonel said. No, I said. The barber froze in mid-shave, and the colonel opened his eyes. Please, sir, you must help me, I said quickly, as I once helped you. She sold my sister. Please, sir, I'll do anything just to find Ruth. She's so small and... The door behind us opened. Two more sentries filed in, followed by Madame Lockton, breathing hard, and a tall gentleman I'd not seen before. My sentry waved me further into the room so that the newcomers might all fit. I worked my way towards an open window. What is the meaning of this? The colonel asked wearily. Madame's voice cracked across the room. Are you the man in charge? The colonel sighed deeply, waved off the barber, and stood up, his face still half covered with soap. Colonel Thomas Reagan, at your service, ma'am. He bowed stiffly from the waist. How can I be of service? You have stolen my property. We have several clerks assigned to record civilian concerns. My sergeant will show you I will not speak with subordinates or grubby clerks. That chit of a girl belongs to me, Colonel. She has committed terrible crimes and must be punished. I demand you return her to me. The barber rinsed the razor in the water bowl. Reagan looked from Madame to me and back again. What did she do? She abused me most violently, sir. The colonel put out his hand and the barber placed a clean towel in it. Yet it is the girl with blood on her face, the colonel said, wiping away the soap from his chin and cheeks. Madame's eyes narrowed. Give her to me. The sentries shifted their boots on the floor. One cleared his throat. The gentleman who accompanied Madame stepped forward. The law is quite clear on this matter, sir. None of us want to live in a world where servants rule their masters, but the Parliament and the Congress give Madame Lockton rule over her slave. A flock of crows swooped past the window. A three-masted ship, sails unfurled, pushed down the river. Ruth could be on it, or she was already at sea in a dark hold with no candles. Who would feed her? Who would hold her hand when she shook? The girl says you've sold her sister, Colonel Reagan said. Do you mean to purchase Sal for the army? Madame asked. I am sure she'd make a passing fine washerwoman. I shall expect full payment in cash. She handed the towel back to the barber. A washwoman is one thing I don't need right now. If you had any manservants capable of ditch digging, I'd take you up on that offer. But he paused and shook his head. I looked out the window again. One crow had come back. It landed on a carcass near the water's edge, a dead dog or a rat. The crow pecked at the meat of the thing, snatched a pink strip in his beak, and tugged until the piece broke away. He beat his wings once, twice, and flew up in the high air enough to catch a breeze that rode him out over the water. Another man had entered the room. The night of my first visit to the fort, he had worn his uniform coat over his nightshirt. Now his coat was properly buttoned and his breeches tucked into his boots. Thomas, we cannot interfere, he said. This girl is not our concern, and you are late. We dare not keep him waiting. I looked out the window at the carcass. Please, sir, I said in a quiet voice, let me stay. Colonel Reagan fastened his collar without looking at me. The law binds my hands and my actions. You must return with your mistress, he said, concentrating on his task. Even during times of war, we must follow the rules of propriety and civilization. With that, the matter was concluded. Madame turned to thank the man who aided her. The sentry slipped into the hall. Colonel Reagan picked up his hat from the table and set it on his head. As I stepped towards the window, the barber studied me close. He shook his head once from side to side, just as Jenny had back in Rhode Island 100 years ago. Bad advice on both occasions. I bolted for the open window. I almost made it. Chapter 22. Wednesday, July 10th to Monday, July 15th, 1776. But as it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation in the other. Thomas Jefferson, writing about slavery. When I woke, the barrel of a gun was stuck up underneath my chin. Men voices shouted, boots stomped, a rain of hands grabbed me, countless bodies, smelly breath, unwashed feet. My head felt cracked in 3 pieces. A woman shrieked and shrieked. She was a crow shattering the air with her harsh calls. I moved, not by my own device. My toes dragged in the dirt. They tried to pull my arms from my body, ripping the arms off of a cloth doll. They dragged me from one place to a second place. More shouts, more shrieks and whistles and calls, rumbling thunder voices. They dragged me from the second place to the third place, every voice sowing the wind, all things summoning the whirlwind that would sweep us all away to drown in the deepest sea. My thoughts would not line up like good soldiers. They swarmed afield and fled, chasing the blood that dripped from my head and stained my shift. My eyes were swelled up and hard to see through. Someone had stolen a tooth or two. They tied my hands together with prickly rope. They tied the rope to the back of a cart. They tied a horse to the front of the cart. The horse lifted one tired hoof after another and dragged the cart, and the cart dragged me up the broad street where people smiled and laughed and pointed. My eyes cast down, the cobblestones mocked too. I tried to figure the whos and the whys of the matter, but my own name escaped me. I knew only the pain in my head and the iron taste of lost teeth. My memory broke into bits when they beat my head. They took me to the dungeon under City Hall to await my trial. The jailer locked me in a cell with a toothless madwoman who'd huddled in the corner and spat at me. She pulled the hairs from her head and dropped them to the mud. She was near bald. At sunset, the jailer came back with a cup of water and a piece of foul pork half the size of my hand. Dirty men in the other cells fought each other all night long. On the second day, we heard shouts and screams from the world above us. Then came the boom and roar of cannons, followed by the crack of musket fire and the sounds of hundreds of boots shaking the earth. Some prisoners hollered in panic and tried to pull their chains from the stone walls. The madwoman in my cell laughed and laughed, slapping her skirts. At last, the noise above ceased. The jailers threw buckets of cold water on the men who had lost their senses in fear. They said for us to shut our gobs. The British had sailed their warships up the North River and had fired on the town, but now all danger was past. Anyone who continued to blubber would feel the lash. I said not a word. The second night was the same as the first, filled with moans and muttering, scratching, and the sound of teeth and claw. It rained. Water pooled on the floor and soaked through my shoes. Rats wandered in and out of the cells, squeezing their fat bottoms through the bars. I dared not sleep for fear they would bite me. The madwoman and the rats stayed in the corner, red eyes waiting for me all night long. On the third morning, the jailer unlocked my cell and motioned for me to follow him. The madwoman laughed again. He took me up the stairs to the courtroom. It was as big as the inside of a church, with the same white walls and dark wood. The windows were of clear glass, grimy with neglect. They stood me behind a rail, kept my hands tied. I shook with fever and hunger. Oyez, 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 called a man in the shadows. He said more, but his words slurred together. A tall man wearing black robes and a long wig sat at the table that was raised on a platform. He was a judge. This was a court. My head was broke, and my sister was stole, and I was lost. The woman with the crow voice, her that threw the picture at me, stood up. I raised my head to look at her. Someone poked a stick in my ribs hard and hissed at me. I lowered my eyes. Voices buzzed and blurred into words I did not understand. Lockton, I finally remembered. Lockton, Madame Lockton, her that bought us, her that stole Ruth away. I kept my head down but lifted my eyes so they pained me. The pain was good. It drew back the curtain of my mind and forced me to pay attention. Madame was pretending to cry into her lace handkerchief. And I, but a poor woman alone, my husband having fled for reasons I cannot comprehend. I plead with your honor to assist me in the correct punishment of this girl. The judge frowned and asked questions of two officers who stood near Madame. I wanted to ask about Ruth and where the blood on my shift came from and who broke my teeth, but I was the only person in the room whose hands were tied, so I kept silent. Questions were asked of the incident. Lies were given as answers. Finally, the judge said, "Where is the housekeeper who saw this crime, Mrs. Lockton?" "Becky is indisposed, sir," Madame answers. "She suffers the ague." "And there are no other witnesses to the events you described?" A stranger stood up in the back of the room. "I was passing in the street, Your Honor," he said. "I heard the commotion, saw the girl fleeing, and observed the destruction myself." "There are several other people of standing willing to testify, Your Honor," Madame added. Her tears had mysteriously vanished. The judge used the end of his quill to scratch at an itch under his wig. "It is clear that this slave has violated the person of her master, destroyed valuable property, and attempted to run away, all contrary to the laws of our colony." State, Your Honor, reminded the lawyer. We are a state now. Independence and all that. The judge rolled his eyes. Colony state. Who knows what it'll be next? He sighed deeply. No matter. This girl's crimes of insolence, property destruction, and running away from her rightful owner are not devious enough to warrant a sentence of death. Do you have any wishes as to the punishment that I should consider, Mrs. Lockton? Madame sighed deeply, like my behavior caused her great sadness. She is a willful girl, Your Honor, with numerous character defects. I believe a permanent reminder of this day might prove the appropriate remedy. Her words struck in the air like flies caught in a spider's web. I could make no sense of them. I could make no sense of anything. The judge scratched at his wig with fresh vigor. You want her branded, then? 20 strokes of the lash would be more in keeping with her crimes. We are now led by men from Virginia, I am told, she said. Land of my birth, I assure your honor that in Virginia we do not tolerate the rebellion of slaves. The judge nodded. Once kindled, rebellion can spread like wildfire. Do you want your husband's initials used? Madame shot a sideways glance at me. I prefer the girl branded with the letter I for insolence. It will alert people to her tendencies and serve as a reminder of her weakness. The judge picked up his gavel. So be it. Sal Lockton, it is the order of this court that you be branded on your right cheek with the letter of I in punishment for your crimes against Lady Mistress. Crack! The gavel cracked on the block of wood. Next case.